Welcome to the Inquiring Spirit podcast. I'm Ravi Joseph.
Hi, I'm Bharat.
Today we're talking about the work of Balaji Srinivasan. So when I was kind of reviewing my list of most interesting things I read in 2024, I was surprised that the most interesting thing I wrote was probably Balaji's book, The Network State. So I thought it would be interesting to bring this in here to discuss. So if it's okay, I'll just give a brief overview of his ideas and why I think they're interesting. So Balaji Srinivasan is he's a tech guy. He founded I think a biotech company and was involved in some other entrepreneurial ventures. But now, as far as I can tell, he's really going all in on this idea of the network state, and putting kind of both intellectual and entrepreneurial energy behind trying to make this idea a reality. Um, so the network state idea is kind of a cross between online communities, excuse me, startups and countries. It's this kind of new form of social organization that he posits as possible with the latest kind of technological and social developments in the world. So just as you have people coming together through social media, with the network state idea, you'd have people from different parts of the world coming together with a shared moral vision. And they could, from that point, create a startup society. And another new thing that's in play that he argues would make this form of social organization possible is the development of cryptocurrency. So in addition to um, a startup society, people come together with a shared moral vision. You'd also have a currency basis. You'd have an economic basis with people carving out economic niches with startups. And there's also a self-defense angle, which he doesn't go into extensively. But I think his implication is that the cryptographic communication, so encrypted communications, could serve as at least part of the kind of self-defense requirements needed um, for for the people living in the society to be free of different kinds of interference. So I think there's a lot to be worked out. This idea is still. So I guess my main critiques of this at this point are, first of all, do these new internet value systems provide enough of a basis for people to come together to the point of wanting to build a country? I mean, I think Israel was an example of a something where a new country was founded and people put a lot of energy into making that happen. But that was based around a really deeply shared religion and cultural experience that I'm not sure just bringing together internet people will allow for. And yeah, all the other great nationalist struggles of the 20th century. Similarly, people were really bought in on a deep fundamental level on some sort of national idea or national identity that they were willing to go to great lengths um, to pursue. And I'm not sure any of the kind of binding ideas that he presents in this book. He gives the example of like dietary ideas or something like that. So I'm not sure those rise to the level of bringing people together enough. And second of all, I think the self-defense question is really still pretty big because it seems to me that any startup society could still be kind of held hostage um, by the country who dominates the territory um, with their physical army. So the question is still you and what army to a prospective startup society. But I think this is a tremendously interesting idea, and I think we're going to see experiments along these lines. We're already seeing different kinds of experimental cities being founded. We're already seeing this thing of online communities trying to turn into offline communities. Everywhere on the internet, you see an online community, you see people wanting to organize events and not just keep things online. So people are going to start coming together. There's going to be the question of, well, can we organize at a deeper level? Can we bring our families together? Can we bring our economic bases together? And from there, you have the roots of a real possibility of like political organization. So I think the question is not whether this is going to happen, but exactly how far it's going to go. Will it reach as far as he says with like diplomatic recognition of these little polities, with the major recognized countries, or will it just be some form of organization that doesn't quite reach that level? So I think the question is not whether it's happening, but to what degree it will happen. Um, so another thing, a reason I think this is interesting is because it's really kind of new thinking about what the basis of a nation or country is. I think this is an interesting um, discussion that we're having. So recently on Twitter, there's been this flare up about immigration with different parts of the Trump coalition arguing um, about skilled immigration and kind of nativist right saying that, we don't want any immigration at all, even if they're skilled immigration, and the tech billionaires, who of course are increasingly on the Trump side, saying that, well, actually, we need immigration for America to be number one, to maintain its economic edge. So that brings up the question of, what is a nation? Is it a group of people, or is it a group of people bound together by the shared drive towards excellence? Who gets to share in the benefits of the nation? And obviously, there's things like racism on one side and greed on the other side. But I think beyond those more uncharitable dynamics, there's this legitimate question of like, what is a nation? What does it do? Who is it for? And so Balaji's new idea just complicates it further. Well, if a nation is just a group of people with a shared moral principle, they don't have to be all in the United States. One could be in Singapore, and one could be in Japan, and one could be in India, and they could have a shared moral commitment just as intense as anybody, like the collective population of Nepal or something. There's no reason why only Mozambique, that area of the world, has a strong enough moral cohesion to be a nation. They could be all over the world. And if a group of people can all over the world can form moral cohesion and attract talents, why can't they attract talents just as much as Silicon Valley can attract talent? So I think it uh, yeah, complicates a lot of these questions about nation um and political organization in an interesting way. Um, So besides the network state is kind of his big idea. But I would say another thing that interested me about his work was not just the big network state idea, but just the way he thinks. And this is apparent if you read his book. He has all these like fascinating like symmetries and patterns that he points out in the way that societies work, that I found really interesting. So just to give quickly a few examples. Um, One idea he pointed out was the idea that left and right is not just a principle that holds since the French Revolution in Western societies, but there's kind of a generalized leftist and rightism, where there's always going to be two groups in a society, one that is kind of wanting to distribute a shared resource, and the other group that is arguing that the shared resource cannot be distributed, um, and that trying to distribute it um, will kind of destroy that shared resource. That's a really interesting concept. It's not just about economic prosperity as we might see in modern societies, but could equally apply to something like land reform in societies before our current economic paradigm. Another one of these patterns that he points out is um, the idea of God versus network versus state. So his argument that what societies are organized around at one point was the idea of this uh, all-knowing God that could view your actions, and people were afraid of that. And then at a later point, they placed faith in a state that um, this is again the idea of the national idea, like holding the idea that there's this transcendent national entity that you would serve in a really direct way. And his argument is that people are losing faith in the state idea or the national idea, and that I don't know if that's true, but he gives some interesting examples about how there's increased faith in the technological network. So the phenomenon of people having faith that Bitcoin is going to work out as a currency, for example, being an example of people believing in the network over the state. Um, so again, there's I don't know if this is true or well, I'll give my prep my qualifications on this after I just point out these last examples. Another one was of these idea patterns is the gap between or sorry, the distinction between technological and moral progress. So we're very used to thinking about technological progress as how it doesn't produce moral progress, but it's possible that you kind of engineer moral progress on its own and see that as an kind of this its own domain of progress and just as we work to engineer technological progress, work to engineer moral progress in society and kind of deliberately create startup societies just as we create economic startups. Um, and in this analogy, um, VCs would be people that fund technological progress by betting on new ideas. And similarly, on the moral side, you have philanthropists funding moral projects and betting on moral ideas. So I thought that was an interesting, again, these little symmetries that he points out that make you think in a different way. Um, Yeah, so again, all these ideas that he points out are not necessarily true. I think they're just really interesting like reframes or different ways of organizing your thought. Um, and I think what the value that he really provides is not necessarily that of a kind of um, dispassionate person trying to find out what's kind of abstractly true about the world. The way I've been thinking about him is that he's what political theorist Samo Burrier calls a live player, someone who kind of creates these maps of the way the world is working now and tries to allows other people to take action on them and kind of uses them for his own guide to action. So it really seems to me like a way of yeah, again, not deeply trying to understand the truth, not trying to understand how he fits into intellectual history, but trying to create this live map of how the world is actually working now and how specifically how we can take action on the world to uh um yeah, to serve whatever aim you would like to serve. And I think that it goes with a certain amount of slapdash quality to some of the thinking. It's again not the most rigorous thinking, not the most um not the most tightly wound or exquisite thinking, but it's deeply interesting, deeply well thought out, deeply new, fresh, and innovative. Um so I think that's why it's worth giving him a hearing at least and seeing what these things are that he's pointing out and seeing to what extent they're relevant, to what extent they can be plugged into other models of how the world works and where it's going. Yeah, so thanks for um, letting me present this initially. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Bharat.
Yeah, thanks for that very good introduction. I myself haven't read the whole thing. Luckily, he has this like at the very beginning, these kind of snippets of his view in one sentence, a paragraph, a few pages. Uh, but then, as deep as one wants to go, and then there was also the interesting article that we had read about sort of the being critical of the network state idea, which I found interesting. And yeah, I think uh, my I do think that a lot of what Balaji Srinivasan is saying is really interesting, and I think sort of from my point of view, I kind of what makes me feel curious about it and interested is that it is sort of highlighting connected to, I think, what, as you pointed out, this current fissure that has erupted or come to the surface among the sort of MAGA movement, right, and the tech right, that there is a notion of anti-woke, anti-leftist views which are nonetheless very global. So there's a very globalist in the sense that they're not really rooted in particular nations. So there, it's for I think I would say in the last 10, 20 years, there's this kind of this general maybe simplification that the left is sort of are globalists. They want to have a global government. They want to have sort of this one picture. And the right or the conservative view is more local in the sense that they want to hold on to sort of local traditions, local ideas of particular nationhood, and so forth. And so this idea of, okay, it's sort of non-global versus global was the right left distinction. And I think Balaji seems to me a very clear, well thought out articulation where this distinction sort of is now passé, where what he's articulating is not at all. It's certainly conservative in many ways, or right wing, right leaning. It's very libertarian. The whole project is extremely libertarian, um, but it's libertarian in an almost globalist way, in the sense of sort of saying, okay, now the locus of individual action and identity isn't certainly isn't local communities or even nations, but the world globe itself. So that somebody, I might have a, if I was part of a network state, I might have a deeper connection with somebody in Singapore and in, South Africa or in Egypt or Brazil than I do with my neighbors or with other people who are Americans, right? And that I think is it's a I think it's a very fascinating thing to think about. That is sort of where we're headed, where, yeah, technology has made the world closer. Immigration has made the world much more integrated in the 20th century. There are all sorts of things that have happened in the 20th century that have made the world sort of feel more tightly bound. And now, in this new domain of the world as being the locus of activity, these different philosophical viewpoints are erupting, where you could have a more right-leaning or a left-leaning, you could have a more religious or an atheistic, like, so Balaji, I mean, religion seems to play no role at all in Balaji's sort of framework. It is another way in which it is not right leaning as we normally tend to think of it. Right? So it's kind of post religion, post, it seems to be a post a lot of things, right? And that to me is interesting, but also I would say this is where I would think is it's a little bit of a, I wouldn't want to say fantasy because that makes it seem like I'm putting it down, because a lot of good thinking often has a fantasy element. It's just sort of thinking out a thought experiment and trying to put it into reality. Right. But I think it's unclear to me how many people actually resonate with this picture that he's articulating, in the sense that whether it is something that if you're in the tech world and you're creating these sort of infrastructure of this global internet world, then I would think naturally it'll feel like, yes, this is going to be the future for everyone, or this is not, many people will come to this future, right? So it's a little bit like I think the feeling of somebody who's on the cutting edge of something, um, sort of thinking the whole world is he's remaking the world in the language of an internet tech entrepreneur, right? So that's how it looks to me, right? It's sort of like, what does it look like if you're sort of seeing the world from the perspective, yes, this new sort of internet AI Silicon Valley world that is being constructed across the world, and that's connecting people. What does it look like when you sort of rethink concepts like nationhood, community, meaning, all of these things? Which is, I think, which is the question of our time. I would certainly agree. Uh, Except he's also bringing into bear, and this is where I think I do agree with the article, which was critical of him. I mean, but is also bringing a fair amount of somewhat traditional ideas to bear to that, right? So there is sort of all this cutting edge technology stuff and then cutting edge reformulation of old concepts into new ways of thinking, which seem to me rather cutting edge, right? And whether you agree or disagree, whether you want to partake of it or not, you sort of think, okay, this is kind of laying out some of the terms of the new dialogue that are going to need to happen, right? So in that sense, I find it very interesting. Um, but then part of the very cutting edgeness of it can mask the extent to which a lot of really ideas that have not been thought through are coming along with it, right? And where there's a lot of questions that sort of one might wonder, wait, is this completely new, or is it more like somebody who's taking, say, a certain libertarian ideas and just sort of generalizing from it? So when I was reading it, for example, when I think about his picture of the network state, I sort of think, wait, what happens to all the vast number of people who are turning right in the world right now? They're not turning right in this way. They're turning right in some kind of way. They want to actually hold on to Christianity or Hinduism, or they want to hold on to what they think India means or America or Germany means, right? So they are fighting over these concepts, which are sort of that it looks like Balaji is sort of setting off to the side. It's like, look, we don't need to worry about that. You just sort of, you know, if you find that what you want is a keto diet, then this is the sort of the founding principle that you want to structure your life around, then you can find people. But then is that going to be something that is going to have a seat at the UN? Is a certain like the notion of nationhood that he's articulating is now there are going to be presumably millions of nations in this. There's nothing in principle that is um, different than sort of having reading groups or something, but somehow deeper, right? So to me, it feels like there's a lot of questions that we tend to think about as part of a meaningful life that it's not obvious how it kicks in here. So I'll give another example, right? So when I was thinking about that sort of thing, okay, what happens to like questions of like, how can we help each other as people, right? What happens to questions of, oh, how do we help those who are worse off than us, right? Right? And the idea that somehow you have to first you care about your identity first, such that you sort of think, okay, I have this need or I have this value system. I'm going to connect with that. Okay, well, what happens if the things that you connect with, you don't, people don't care how to care about other people in this framework at all, right? That to me is strikes me as not just anti-conservative. I mean, it strikes me as anti-human nature almost, right? Like that is an extreme picture where that would be completely orthogonal to the tens of thousands of years of human evolution almost, where we sort of think of human beings as part of a community in a local sense, where the idea that they are helping other people who are part of that community is very crucial. This is now being abstracted. Okay, if you're part of a network state, you might want to help other people who are in your network state. But to get to a place where you get to be in a network state, where you get to have computer access, where you get to have sort of where you understand even what bitcoins are and how it works, and the level at which you would identify with other quote unquote citizens of your network state in this way seems to be such a high level of uh, both material and intellectual well-being, right? Like you have to be really smart. You have to be technologically proficient. You have to have the material wherewithal to have that technology, to live in it, to move in it, to define all of your terms in this way. I could imagine that if you are a millionaire in, this computer world, this could seem like, yeah, this is the future we're creating. But it's very natural sort of this is maybe also how income inequality is just going to get much, much worse. All sorts of problems we have are going to are going to get worse, where there's going to be this bifurcation where there are people who are going around connecting to other people around the world, living in this very highly sort of intellectualized, technologized communities. Uh, and a lot of people are just going to be left out of that game. And I think that, to me, sort of strikes me as fundamentally somehow not spiritual. There's something very sort of uh, much like people of a certain niche have vast power over the world right now. And that this is sort of like an articulation of what that would look like if those people really did take over. And it's both exciting in one way, but then it's kind of like, okay, well, what happens to the 95% of the population who for whom a lot of these concepts are completely foreign, right? Like they have to now, how do they live? So that would be, I think that's kind of my, I'm both excited and interested, like, oh, this is an interesting, because he's a very thoughtful person, obviously super smart, very articulate. Um, but also I'm like, okay, well, but how does this connect to sort of maybe some of our more ordinary concerns of human life, in terms of helping people, in terms of our identities, like, you know, and what if we're not have this it's a very individualistic picture, very much modern in that sense. It places this human choice at the forefront of everything, right? And that kind of goes against maybe even like, for example, a Heideggerian picture of human life, where we sort of feel part of our life identities are driven by what we're thrown into, including the groups and identities we're thrown into, that we don't choose, right? So let me stop there. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah,
Which,
all good points. And I should say I wouldn't say I'm in favor of the network state per se. I just think it's an interesting window onto things that could happen to some extent are happening. Um,
no, yeah,
yeah,
definitely. I think
yeah, I'm
it
not.
does seem like it is having a big, I could see how for a certain group of people, this feels very much like, this is like a startup philosophy of some kind, right? It's like this is sketching out a world we can live into. And it does seem like a lot of relatively financially and otherwise influential people are very attracted to this picture. That to me, I think, is part of it's like why it's important to think about it. I think it's also interesting to think about, okay, if we do want somehow the world to be as one, somehow, like this like old kind of liberal fantasies, right? So like, I feel like we're all going to somehow live in harmony. Then I think this seems more like, okay, what does that even look like? Why imagine that thinking globally must mean that the world will all be one, as opposed to there's just going to be all these other ways in which people are going to disagree with each other at a global level. And that's kind of what Balaji is sort of planting his flag on. Okay, here's the way I see the global world, and a lot of people might find this attractive.
Mm. Um, yeah, so going back to a couple of your points, so the point about, who's going to take care of people that are not part of the number state community. I think that's a totally valid point. But I would also point out that to some extent that's already what's happening in the way the world is currently set up. That we have these people are getting atomized, but to the extent that we have some sort of social connections, people are staying within their again, they're kind of niche of their socioeconomic class, and they don't necessarily have connection with the people that are maybe homeless or suffering different kinds of life distress. And there's a real question of, what is our link to these people? There's obviously the sense that, as humans, we have this kind of abstract relationship to each other, but in practice, the for most people, this help that is offered to the less fortunate is offered through the abstraction of the state as this kind of all encompassing entity that ha has the relation to all people. It's not directly uh, through our own kind of innate sense of there being a community of interests or a community between ourselves and these other people. So I think there's a sense in which communities have already are breaking down and have already broken down to the sense where the less fortunate are not the people in our community who are less fortunate, but just this kind of abstract group of people that are kind of disconnected with us in some way. And you're right, that's not a spiritual attitude, but that's part of what already needs to be remedied, whether or not these kinds of network state kind of setups happen or not. That's an ongoing problem, regardless of whether those new setups happen. Um, so with your question about um, kind of, well, this vision will only apply to a small number of people. I think to some extent, yeah, I think the pure like network state vision of the people that are going to read Balaji Srinivasan are probably not that big and probably just these tech people. But I think there's a sense in which technology provides the infrastructure and I think it's a more human thing to provide the actual content. So again, in Facebook, you say, well, nobody's going to be interested in these huge servers running these social media posts. Well, no, nobody's interested in the engineering behind Facebook, but everybody wants to share content about their graduation photos and their vacation photos and their status updates. So that's what the people are interested in. So in the same way, I think the network state idea provides this infrastructure for, well, yeah, we can have these cryptographic currencies and we can have these ways that people come together around moral visions, but the actual content of the moral visions might not come from Balaji Srinivasan. It might come from Mr. Beast or Gary Vee or these other people that have this content that appeals to people on a human level. I think they're going to be the ones that are serving as these kinds of leaders of the actual human content of the network state.
I
So
can't. Sorry, I can't jump in. That's great. I
yeah,
don't want Mr. Beast to be my leader. Like
oh,
I don't
I
like
agree.
for
I don't
anybody,
either.
right? This is
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
he's great for what he does, but I mean the idea that but that's actually what's worrisome to
Yeah.
me. Like I would sort of think where there is sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but I just want to flag that. I would say
Mhm.
no, this is there's something very it's like when I look at it from certain angle, I sort of think this is really amazing and fantastic. Then when I look at it from another angle, I think, oh my God, this is like these guys are not thinking this through at all. Like they really are sort of very much it kind of seems in line with this whole attitude of like, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and all these like they really are kind of like just like a bull in a china shop. They're just happy to break things and not really thinking about what they're going to break because they think that they are the smartest and they have the most money and they're at the cutting edge of the technology and where the world is going and they're not caring. And this is where it seems to me that they're more like the left of the French Revolution. Like they're the ones who are like, let's read the Balaji's network state has a very much a feel of like the Jacobins sort of being like, yes, we're going to rethink what the calendar should be, and we're going to rethink sort of what the foundational sort of concepts of our society are going to be, right? And you're sort of rethinking things, sort of thinking everything can shift now, right? And but the everything might actually sort of there's a lot of good that's going to get scuttled in this way that maybe isn't important to them, right? And so I think part of what bugs me is the presumption that is behind this picture of sort of saying if you can be somebody who can start do this, then then you deserve to be a leader who gets to control sort of how things go, right? As opposed to sort of, in a way, it kind of seems to be replicating all the problems with the left without somehow while covering it over by saying, no, no, we're against the left because we're against being woke. But all of the other problems of they're going to be a small subset of people who get to rule things, who get to say what is morally correct, what is morally okay, what is bad, and power makes, might makes right. And we just should have the freedom to do all these things. That is sort of what I see sort of behind this, right? It's sort of it's not. This is where I feel like the article was interesting because it was sort of trying to say, look, yes, all these networks are great. We can use technology, we can use AI to rethink things, but maybe it can reshape our world in different ways where, okay, the people who really are gotten left behind in the current state, in the world, the way the world is right now, maybe we should try to figure out how to help them more directly. If the left failed at that, then it seems like that is what we should be addressing, right? And this is where the fight between sort of Elon Musk and the nativists in the MAGA movement seems fascinating in this regard because it does seem right to sort of say, okay, if there are a bunch of people who really got left behind, given how America has went in the last 40 years, I don't see how the network state helps them at all, right? Like what in the network state is speaking to any of those issues? And this seems to be this funny grafting that's happening where, uh, Peter Thiel and, JD Vance are somehow like, oh yeah, these are connected somehow. What all they seem connected by is that they both hate the left, right? Like both of these parties hate the left. That's the only thing that's connecting them. But if you take out that point, basically Elon Musk is just saying, Vivek Ramaswamy, like, yeah, Americans are stupid. That's why it's their own problem that they can't help with all this stuff. Their American culture is crazy, right? So I would like to sort of think, okay, let's think about all the problems with the left. Think about how to address the economic issues, the cultural issues, the meaning issues, the spiritual issues that traditional liberal societies have sidelined. I don't see the network state addressing either the economic left behind issues or the meaning issues or the social community issues. It seems to exacerbate all of those issues. And I'm kind of like, but then I kind of feel like it is giving me a window into maybe how some subset of the Silicon Valley people are thinking about it. And it's kind of like, uh, yeah, I'll just say, yeah, right. So it's kind of like, so what would be your take? Or what do you think this is meant to address the issues that the left didn't get right? Or is it just like, yeah, the left is horrible, and now here's this wonderful other picture, but we're not trying to fix what the left didn't get right?
Mm, yeah. Uh, Good question. Um, so I think to some extent, um, like there's this idea that common criticism of crypto, that crypto is a solution without a problem. So people devise this like new method of tallying up ledgers and connecting that to cryptography or whatever. And they say, wow, this is really cool. Let's try to do something with it. And then they try to insert it in all these different situations, and nobody really cares because it doesn't solve a problem. So it sounds like that's a similar situation thing that you're saying with the network state. Well, it doesn't solve this problem that I have. Balaji might say, well, it's this cool idea. Um,
I
but
can see
I
that
think,
it could
yeah,
solve problems he has, maybe. I can see that.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's what
Yeah.
their problems that he has, like overregulation, like um uh that's what Musk is talking about and Ramaswamy is talking about. But I don't know how it might be a problem for the billionaires, but I don't know to what extent the everyday American is like really, fed up about FAA regulation or something like that, or FDA regulation. Is it really getting in the way of their doing anything? At the level of a company, it might, but at the level of people just going about their daily lives, it's not clear what, bureaucratic regulation really has to do with their lives, except as it impacts them on this macro scale of, well, their company might have to deal with regulation, so that indirectly impacts them. Um, so what else does it solve? I think it's not that it solves anything necessarily, but that um, it's a set of possibilities um, that so like I'm trying to think of a good example here. Um, it's like a an alternate lens onto the world that makes certain possibilities more salient and other possibilities less salient. So like viewing Bitcoin um as so one of the things I'm interested in about Srinivasan's work and other people like Justin Murphy and some other thinkers is crypto as a philosophical position. So I don't have much interest in the financial element of crypto. I don't own any crypto or anything like that. But people have been writing about how crypto is kind of this philosophical position of decentralization and freedom. Um, and so they're associating these values to Bitcoin and saying that Bitcoin is what stands for like sound money against like bureaucratic tampering with the money supply, and then that correlates also to sound. So Balaji also associates it with this idea of like sound technical merit and achievement and all these like cultural values that he tries to lump in and kind of sees this entire so by association he says that the entire like startup merit driven ethos of Silicon Valley is associated to Bitcoin, is associated to this entire moral system that is contrasted both to New York Times wokeness on one hand and the CCP's authoritarianism on the other hand. So he sees this network state as part of this entire cultural movement that like uh that sees so I think what he's getting at is that um this is a cultural stance um that is different than the other three cultures. So one of these other ideas that he that I didn't mention at the beginning was NYT versus CCP versus BTC. So three different poles and three different value systems. The And so his viewing the this kind of Silicon Valley cultural ethos as correlated to Bitcoin, so that providing like a cultural, monetary, technological basis for a way of organizing society. So again, I don't necessarily agree with that. I don't think that's the way that I want to live. But once you see that pattern, it makes uh it's a lens that doesn't um it doesn't explain everything, but it's a useful pattern that I'm glad that I had insight into. Um
Can I can
so
I can I
yeah, yeah,
ask you about that?
yeah.
Because this I think gets to maybe something, yeah, that's central here, right? So sort of as somebody who doesn't know much about Bitcoin,
Mm,
right? Right, this contrast, this division of the world into New York Times versus sort of the Chinese government versus Bitcoin is to me like completely random, right? This is like saying the world is divided into ducks, trees, and ice cream. And we have to decide between these three things. And I think ice cream is the best worldview to have. That's kind of how it sounds to me. It's like New York Times and sort of the Chinese sort of government are not in the same, they're not in the same sphere of things, right? And Bitcoin isn't in the same sphere as these other two things. These are like apples, oranges, and bananas. But, and I think this is where I'm skeptical of the clarifying element of Srinivasan's worldview, right? It's clarifying because it feels clarifying because it's kind of like you sort of you take all the chess pieces off the board, and then you're like, and now we're going to play a game with these three pieces, right? And sometimes when you have a lot of power, you get to do that. You get to say these are the relevant terms of the debate, which end up being the relevant terms because that's what the powerful people are thinking about, not because that is actually tracking somehow in some deeper way what are the relevant categories, right? Like if I want to know, of course it matters a lot if I want to know Barack Obama, how Barack Obama sees the world, right? Or if Donald Trump sees the world, because those kinds of people have a lot of sway, and they have a lot of power, right? And so they can move pieces. Obama can tomorrow call up the New York Times and say something, and it'll have repercussions, right? And that doesn't mean that the way Obama sees the world is somehow right, right? So I'm sort of like I'm skeptical that what background, like from what framework, I get it that as a human being, Srinivasan can be like, I think the world is divided into these three categories right now, right? But when that is heard by a lot of people, I don't think they're hearing it that way. I think they're hearing it like this guy who made $350 million off of selling his company and who has the ear of all these tech billionaires and who sort of sounds like a prophet for the internet world, he must know what he's talking about, right? And I kind of feel like that power is somehow being he's kind of like somebody like Srinivasan is benefiting off of that power dynamic. It's kind of like a guru figure for the tech world who thinks that they think for themselves about everything. And so they can't possibly have guru figures. And I kind of feel like this is what a guru figure looks like for that world, which is doing a lot of techie stuff, but who don't have connection to the cultural dynamics of society, not through religion, not through philosophy, not through literature, not even through movies and other domains of sort of culture making, right? So these tech people need culture translators, who can sort of put a cultural framing on what they're doing, right? And it looks to me like Balaji Srinivasan is a really brilliant at that. That's what he's doing. He's sort of putting a cultural framing onto saying, yeah, these guys, mostly guys who are doing all this, they are doing this fantastic, amazing stuff. And now I'm going to tell you this amazing stuff they're doing and put it in a framework. I sort of tend to think, is this that different from, you know, the railroad barons sort of setting up museums and things like this, where they're sort of trying to they're making their money and their freedom and their personal growth in one way, and they need to translate that in a way that people might understand. So if somebody, who's a tech billionaire is talking to their neighbor who's not, or he's talking to ordinary people, they might say, "Oh, look, what we're doing is giving this whole vision." And then you get pointed to something like Srinivasan's work, and the person's like, "Oh, okay, I now this is a whole framework I have to understand." And you get pulled into that framework and you sort of think this might help you, but it's not obvious that this will help. This is where it seems to me so parallel to what the left got wrong, right? The left totally got wrong that thinking about Rawls is going to help most people, and if they've said, well, how is this helping us? They're like, no, look, listen, you need to read Rawls, you need to read, Kant, or you need to sort of, think about what we're saying about the latest issues in, you know, feminism. This will really help you understand why, even if you're not benefiting financially or morally or something, this is really for the better for you, right? And I kind of feel like this feels extremely parallel in that way because exactly you know, like I have to think about the Bitcoin world to now feel like I have to. understand all the like that just seems kind of like I'm being forced something. You know, I have to listen to what he's saying because people who believe what he's saying have a lot of power right now. So it's just not true that even though he put it for free on the internet, this is somehow free. It's no, I have to listen to this in a way that I don't have to read a lot of professors say because they have no power. This guy has a lot of power. And I would love to see somebody with a lot of power be more self-reflective about the fact that they have this power. And I'm none of this again is questioning what I think you're rightly pointing out, that the ideas are fascinating as ideas, right? They might even be, maybe they'll be implemented, as you say, maybe they'll be implemented in all sorts of ways. Um, but I do feel like there's a bit of a marketing thing here happening where we're being presented with something as creating more change than it in fact is. All right, I feel like I've been going very hard on my objections. So let me hold for now and come back to some positive things also. So go ahead.
Mhm. Yeah, with the like NYT, BTC, CCP thing, I agree. There's things that leaves out. Like I think the biggest thing that leaves out is the what about the role of the U.S. Army, for example? Where does that fit in? And that's not clear. And I think it also overstates the importance of the actual influence of Bitcoin. It's definitely not a like empirically a power center that can
But it
rival the
also
other
but it
two at
also
this
leaves
point.
out the thing that we just had an election where a lot of people voted because they are, I mean, they have values like they believe in America, that they believe in Christianity. That, like, New York Times is, we could say, is left atheist. Chinese government certainly atheist. Bitcoin got nothing to do with religion, right? So the very framing seems kind of strangely disconnected from any kind of frameworks of value from the past, right? So I guess I'm kind of focusing on this because that kind of seems like that's a way to say, yeah, all of those people can be left behind. If you don't find this the framing, the relevant framing, then you're just kind of stuck in the past and you don't understand what the true enlightened modern cutting edge perspective is. The modern cutting edge perspective is you could live in Singapore, you could have connections in India and America and all over, and you can dip into right wing governments in all these countries, but still sort of have your sort of float above all of this stuff, right? And this is kind of starts to sound a lot like this Elysium kind of thing, where you got this upper class rich people living on a different planet, and then all the poor people are stuck on Earth. Kind of framework starting to happen, and it's like, oh well, but all the poor people do care about religion. That's their identities, right? How do we connect those identities with the industrial revolution? That's kind of where we've been stuck for right now, the old left right distinction. Suddenly swoop in these tech billionaires who are kind of like, no, no, the industrial revolution is passe. So the arguments between the farmers and the industrialists, that's already passe. We want to talk about, the people who are kind of into this internet revolution, the digital revolution, right? And if all of these other categories and arguments can go put in the background, right? And this is where I feel like this argument right now happening between the Steve Bannon wing and the Musk wing is really speaking to this broader issue, not just of, oh, one side is anti-Indian and the other side, one side is racist against Indians and the other side is so open-minded. It's one side, I think, is kind of like, look, there's a language that we're all used to that we really like to keep, something like our sort of traditional language of how we see the world. And the left is forcing us out of that. And we don't want to do that. As somebody who voted for Kamala Harris, I'm kind of like, I'm going to lean into trying to learn that lesson. Right. If the left is learning and they're like, okay, we need to learn the lesson, that we need to sort of try to speak to them. being presented with Musk and somebody like Balaji Srinivasan as the people who are going to help us do that seems like no, these people are saying no, all you industrial age people are also all passe. Now you have to think about Bitcoin and you have to think about how many identities can you have online, and these are simply, you don't even Bharat doesn't exist. All that's going to exist is some, you know, whatever name I identity I give myself with my currency and in my thing. Like, is the world anywhere close to being ready for this as opposed to like maybe 100,000 people around the world or a couple of million people who are sort of like jumping on this bandwagon because it seems really exciting? That's kind of my worry, that we might be going down the rabbit hole of this. And, if Srinivasan addresses some of this, then I'd be like, great. Then that person is actually sort of interested in speaking to some of this stuff. But otherwise, I'm kind of like, maybe what's giving him a voice is the fact that he has the ear of a lot of very powerful people.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I think the question of nationalism, for example, is um maybe we should do an episode about this because I think this is still underestimated by the Srinivasan wing and also by the left. Um, and I think the right has a notion of it's too constrictive. So I think nationalism is a blind spot for Srinivasan, who, uh, like I was saying about the God network state idea, he is of the belief that nationalism is kind of like a religion that will kind of wear off in time, just as like other sorts of religions were. Whereas I have the sort of um the only way I can make sense of the idea of nationalism is through this kind of mystical appeal um that Sri Aurobindo um wrote about, where it's this kind of reified occult entity that you're kind of devoted to, and that's the only thing that makes sense to me over and above these kinds of debates over, who exactly belongs to a nation and what is it that there seems to me there has to be this coherent, unified thing that for me exists on a spiritual level that makes us all hold together. Um, so for Srinivasan, like you're saying, he doesn't believe in religion, thinks that's all passé. And I think that leads to a blind spot in seeing how other people could value those things. And I could well see that the impact of people en masse still believing in various sorts of myths and religions and nationalisms and ideologies kind of puts a kind of throws a screw into his kind of really neat symmetries and mappings. And this goes back to what Sri Aurobindo has said, that any kind of mental mapping you put onto the world is always going to be kind of distorted by the actual movements of the life force energy of man. It's too unpredictable. It's too uncontrolled, and your mind is not going to be able to put a lid on that. And so that's going to be violated, whether that be the left establishment's thinking from 2016 that doesn't believe that people have over Trump. It's same as it's going to be with the network state idea. If we try to divide the world into Bitcoin and New York Times, then that's going to be the map that forever assures the way that things are going to play out. No, that's also going to be invalidated by these kinds of um, vital forces, or vital being the life force energy that Sri Aurobindo talks about. Um, so like nationalism could well be one that it might just be that provides a coherent unifying force that means that the network states are not going to be um, to successfully take off, and we're just going to be left at the stage of like content creators and experimental cities, but that do not actually exceed the national principle. So yeah, I could see that that is a way that would things play out, and there could be resurgences of religion that cut against the idea of nationality or that support the idea of nationality, whether it be Christianity having a resurgence in America or some other religious movement that's to come undermining the idea of America. Um, so yeah, I don't disagree with you there. I think the question of how does this benefit people is still um, yeah, I still don't have a good answer to that, and it's an interesting question. Um, I think to some extent one answer is that it doesn't really matter if it benefits people. This is the kind of direction that things are going. So like with social media, there's kind of this inherent logic. I think that's what people are kind of afraid of, that the process of modernity is in some sense not in control of human hands anymore. And it's this kind of like unfolding process that we don't have control over anymore. It doesn't matter if social media benefits people. It's just part of the inherent logic of capitalism. And, everybody's incentivized to want to work for a social media company because they have the money. And then because they have the money, they try to get more people. People are going to be bought into it because they want to share their vacation photos with their friends, and everybody Friends is into it, then advertisers are going to be induced to. So there's this system that ensures that social media kind of takes over the world, and now we're participating in social media because of certain incentives that we have. Um, so just like that, uh, it might not need to benefit anybody. It might just be the next stage in this kind of unfolding of this um, techno capital system that is kind of not in our control. And in that case, so what is any of us to do about it? For people that are trying to find their next thing to do, this might provide a useful mental map. For people that are trying to benefit people, they might take the attitude of the radical exchange article that we're talking about. They might try to use these at the service of digital democracy and seeing how we can incorporate these technologies in a more civically grounded way. Um, but yeah, I think that I don't think it's at the stage where it's pitched to kind of the people as a mass and saying, here's the next thing that will benefit you. I think it's currently being presented as this kind of idea vanguard that people can do what they will with. And it might not be that it has to benefit people. It might be that it's kind of plugged into this logic of the way that the world is unfolding, um and that we just kind of have to kind of grapple with the things that it brings up. Um, because I don't think it solves the problem of like how do we care for people that are less fortunate in our society. I don't think there's anything in the book that really grapples with that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's there's a whole other framework, for example, of how maybe we don't need governments to do things that uh, people can do themselves, and that say maybe business people can do, right? So maybe we don't need healthcare. Maybe we don't need this vast infrastructure of the government for people to have healthcare. If only we had more, I guess, for lack of a better word, we could sort of say if we had benevolent CEOs, right? Like benevolent kings or something. Right? We just have people who care, companies which care, and then they could sort of provide a lot of these things directly. Um, I think you're right that it doesn't look like that's any part of the network state. That's not what it's meant for. That's not what it's trying to address. Um, I mean, I think if I lean into what I like about it, and if I'm trying to understand when you say this is sort of how things are going, which, uh, I guess one way in which this could be seen as the next step after social media, right, could be that social media helped us share certain aspects of our life with other people, right? Like vacations, or even with our ideas, like with blogging, or like the way, we're doing with podcasts or whatever, right? But they don't maybe help us create the walls that we're sharing so far, right? So there is a sort of a limit on what so the internet so far has still been used to share lives which we create in the physical world, as it were, in the digital spaces, right? And I think when I think about what seems like when you first mentioned the network state to me, and I read it, I was sort of like, this is next dimension. That's what I felt that too. I was sort of like, this is, I kind of like, there's something about this. This feels like the next level, right? And so, yeah, if I were to think about what is that dimension that I think you're pointing at, there's something like, okay, this is where things are headed. I guess I might lean into the sense of, yeah, this is sort of thinking through giving people more, letting people have more agency about their own lives, right? This is, I think, the good libertarian and side of it, as it were, right? That sort of say, okay, it's not just that I'm in this job or I'm in this community, I'm in this country, and then, but let me tell you what I think about cats or about, you know, religion or whatever. I function in these walls, but I'll tell you, I can share with you what I think about these walls I function in, but that I could sort of say, okay, I'm gonna maybe take ownership of what kind of communities I'm going to be in and what kind of communities can exist, or something. And, why should I have to accept India or America or whatever as the framework? And I'm just gonna sort of try to create these communities. And once you sort of have that idea, uh, which is already there on a local level, right? Okay, in terms of, okay, meetups or this or that, but it's kind of very local. And what sort of Srinivasan seems to have done is gone to a very high level of thinking about it, in terms of sort of thinking, well, what if it's not just doing a startup, or I'm going to have a group centered around whatever, but that, uh, I can sort of uh, build at the level of a nation, even, right? So that I am freed of the nation, in a certain way. So that, and this is where the libertarian thing, I think, and the power seems to have come together. It's sort of like, if I don't want to be defined by what the country is going to do, then how can I create an entity which can actually compete with a country? And then it's like, oh, I can start my own country. And you sort of think, oh, you could see how clearly a tech billionaire would think this. Like, what I have more money than many countries do. Like, why am I still having to function from within the concept of a nation when I could myself start my own nation? Right. And that's both, I think, next level, as in many people like, yeah, I can start my own city. Why do I need to sort of think about, I don't want to live in San Francisco. I don't want to live, do I have to live in Austin? No, maybe I'll create my own city, a digital city, which has all sorts of connections, right? And something about that feels like, however much we might morally question a lot of these things, it does seem kind of inevitable that people will start having thoughts like this, and they'll want to explore what thoughts like this will look like. And this is 21st century might be partly defined by people simply exploring these kinds of thoughts. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking of when you said this is also, when you said, yeah, this seems something like how things are moving? Or is that some other
Well,
dimension you're thinking of?
yeah, I didn't necessarily mean that network state in particular is definitely how things are moving, but I meant that in general, the like technological unfolding is the way that things are moving, and in that sense, the network state could be the next, like you said, the next wave of that. Um, so um, like for any um um yeah, so like the the next level of technology at one point was social media, and we saw how that played out, and um so that was the next level at that point. And I think there is some aspects of so there are some things the network state has, it brings a couple of things together, some of which might be definitely um, going to play out in the future, and some things that are more speculative. Like, I think the direction of where crypto will go is speculative. We don't quite know whether it's going to take off as a completely autonomous thing, or with the election of Trump, it becomes more likely that it becomes a thing, but there's still a lot of uncertainty whether it will get mass adoption and things like that. Um, so the question of whether people are coming together on the internet, that's already in play, and that's going to accelerate. Whether it's going to come together, um, whether all these things are going to come together in the form of network states, I think that's still unknown. But what is not unknown is the fact that there is this kind of unfolding that we are not completely in control of that's going to keep happening. So whether it looks like network states or whether it looks like some other new thing that we can't quite predict that's going to be still quite new and jarring, I think yeah, that is the thing that is definitely going to keep unrolling, and that's going to keep happening. So I would say what is the this kind of futuristic unfolding is not is going to keep happening. Network state brings together a plausible account of one possible evolution of the way a couple of different factors could come together. Um,
I guess I would sort of think that the network state, yeah, I agree that general technology headed in that direction is, of course, I think absolutely right. Where, the network state is just one example of how it might go. Um, but the network state idea by itself, I think, might run into hiccups that perhaps were not envisioned by Srinivasan, which is that the traditional right and left might very well align against the network state idea, right? And I think I imagine, like, many people on the left might be looking at this current uh, sort of division, in MAGA world, and being like, we totally side with actually the, amazingly enough, the Bannon side of this, right? Right. And so there is much more, like, suddenly now the left leaning sort of, side, where the left has always had a fantasy of where things become global while remaining local, which is sort of encapsulated in the idea of the global village, right? It is this amazing fantasy where 8 billion people are somehow going to be unified while actually not being in this industrialized world where we're sort of disconnected from each other, but somehow with the unity of a village life, where we also have all of that kind of interconnection with each other. And so I think the left very much has a village fantasy as much as the right does, right? Where people get to know each other, tight community bonds, local community bonds, in fact, right? And so this seems to me that for no matter how much Srinivasan is against the New York Times, he's actually out New York timing the New York Times in some of the concepts where the network state is getting articulated, and so it seems to me more likely that it could be possible that the parts of the right and the left might be like, no, we actually just want more. We want the internet, but we want the internet to still be a tool for our human life, as opposed to our lives becoming totally transformed from the inside out in the way that, it's not just how we think about countries. I think part of what Srinivasan is sort of putting his finger on is this is going to change radically our concepts of currency. It will change thereby our concepts of identity. It's going to, what is it, how do parents relate to children in the network state? Like, what does that look like? What does it look like what kind of schools do kids go to, right? I mean, none of these things are actually discussed, as far as I can tell, like, because it's all off on the side of sort of now culture again, right? But those are the things that people are concerned about, and so it's kind of like, how do these things come together? And that seems to be the really big question of, to what extent are we going to let ourselves be transformed through the internet world, right? To how much are we going to let it change? I'm all for changing in a very deep way. Uh, but I suppose I have some fantasy that we can have the radical change while having some link to the past, not just as, maybe it's called not just exiting the past, like ditching it and like we're going to create a new, but somehow you can, and that's why I resonated with the article, even though clearly there is some kind of, the people who wrote the article seem to be more what we would call, I guess, traditional establishment academic types, or whereas, somebody like Balaji Srinivasan is sort of not that. But so there is that divide, even though they all seem to have studied at Stanford or something. They're all somehow connected in the same web, like Srinivasan is. So it seems to me some of the fascinating questions of to what extent are we going to change? How much of our identities are we going to change? How deeply are we going to change them? And even though Srinivasan seems to be right-leaning in many ways, anti-New York Times and all that, anti-woke, he seems as forward thinking in letting us change our concepts as anybody on the lay right now. That is on the sort of the lay of the land right now. That's how it seems to me. I don't know if that's if you would agree with that or if that seems right.
So sorry, if it seems right that he's as open to change as anybody.
Yeah, like he's as radical as it were as anybody, because the whole ethos, the whole libertarian ethos in a certain sense is very much, I mean, obviously he's not on the left, but he's on something. He's not conservative in that sense, right? Because he's
Mm,
sort of he's he is putting his sort of ideas down on the side of we can create new ideas and live our life based on these new ideas rather than we need to sort of go back to some old idea. So in a way, it's a little bit like the trans conversation, right? Like, so there are some people who are sort of like, yeah, we can rethink identities and genders, and that is part of what it is to have freedom, and we shouldn't feel like we're defined biologically on these terms. We should be able to explore different genders. Now, as it turns out, it looks like Srinivasan is not on that side. I don't know. I don't know what his views are, but given his general anti-woke thing, I'm assuming this is part of it, right? But somehow, when it comes to our financial lives or when it comes to how we relate to to countries, he is very much somebody who thinks, no, we can choose these things very deeply, right? That I don't have to be an American in some sense. America is just a contingent identity. Like, I was born with an American body, but I don't identify with that body. I want a new body, right? I want to I have a different kind of body, and maybe a body that is actually national in an interesting way. I have a feeling that for many, many, many people on the right and the traditional right and left, this network state idea is going to seem as hard to process at a gut level as, you know, being open to, hey, your gender identity can also be fluid, in that way. I think for many people, it might be as difficult to process as that. And right now, that might be covered over because they have a common enemy in the left, and they're like, oh yeah, that left is the problem. But there's a like real deep fissure uh, just under the surface of people for whom we're like, yeah, let's remake the whole world in this fascinating new way. And the people who are like, we don't want to remake anything. We just want to keep to what we think the old is. And we just want to go back to that old. Um,
mm. Yeah, I mean, I think Srinivasan is definitely on the side of um like there's this interesting Ribbon Farm post about people who are kind of made the instruments of what technology wants. So if you imagine technology as this kind of occult force, it chooses instruments, and those are people who are kind of compelled, whether by their own will or by this will of technology, um, to kind of enact the changes that the technological system wants to bring about. So Steve Jobs is someone who, kind of saw into the ether and saw that, we need to actually be bring all these apps together on a phone. And Balaji is, to me, kind of playing that same kind of role as someone who's kind of channeling the technological imperative. But that's, of course, not the only imperative that is playing out in our society. So you brought up this article that we have been referencing, and I think what's interesting is if I remember correctly, that magazine is run by Radical Exchange, and so they're a group of kind of left lead. My read is that they're more left-leaning thinkers who are interested in seeing how crypto and these Web3 technologies can be put in service of kind of more traditionally left-leaning goals like community engagement, democracy, civic engagement. So how can these same sort of organizational principles, which in Srinivasan's view can be used to, magnify capitalist, accelerate the development of technology and raise capital. On the other hand, the same technologies can be used to, increase people's feeling of solidarity with their local communities and their governments and things like that. Um, so I think there are forces cutting in more than one way that are seeking to, and so I think that's an important consideration as well. Like there are going to be changes to even what we think of as the left as a result of these technological changes. Like there are all these problems with voting systems getting hacked, but I think is it a long-term solution to have voting be done on paper and with paper receipts? I don't know. I mean, if the tendency is to go paperless, then maybe it makes sense to have democracy be just completely in machines. If it can be secured by these sorts of cryptographic mechanisms, then that might be a way forward if there can be trusted enough. And that's a technological question. So
Wait,
similarly,
wait. It's not
yeah.
just a technological question, though. Right? I mean, it is a technological question if they can be trusted,
Mhm.
but no matter how they're trusted, it is a real social question of whether many people will trust them. They might not trust them anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
So because of our landscape of not knowing what is true and what is conspiracy or whatever, the, what part of what we need for our social lives is a certain kind of trust in each other as people. Uh, and I think part of the question is what is going to generate that kind of trust in the world that is now becoming more and more digital.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I think um, that's literally a pillar of the crypto community that we should evolve to a world without trust, which seems to me misguided. And um, yeah, I think there's maybe a technical sense in which they talk about trust that might be different than the social sense. But regardless, I think that's not necessarily um, the way we want to go.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
that's a good point. I mean, that's kind of why I think of this as a lot of this is not at all spiritual in a certain way, even though it's kind of tracking things, right? Because one would sort of think that this whole cryptocurrency thing is kind of functions on the model that, look, the world is really basically a battlefield, right? And because it's a battlefield is why you have to sort of have all of this kind of crypto protections in the first place, right? And I think both the traditional right and the traditional left are probably more utopian than that, right? Either utopian in the kind of religious sense, because God will help us somehow live as people together, or maybe in a kind of left-leaning utopian where that human nature is good. And if you just tap into that human nature, we'll get to live with each other. So we don't have to go crypto because if you can build trust in a certain way. And so uh, yeah, in a way, the framework of the crypto behind all of this network state thing is kind of suggests a kind of deep, I don't know, anxiety underlying it all, right? Rather than sort of leaning into something maybe more hopeful.
hmm,
That's how it seems to me.
yeah. I think we should do another episode where we go deeper into, well, so possibly we can discuss
Yeah.
crypto if we can
But
find a good reading because I think neither of us are super deep in the crypto world. But it's a
Um,
yeah, big thing that I was yeah. But that might be a good place to wrap up for today. Um, so yeah, thanks a lot for joining me, and this is great.
okay. Yep. Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. All right.
Yep. Thanks, Bharat.
Bye.